Welcome to the 2022 version of the Ausable Bayfield's Flood Emergency Planning Meeting. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Cade, and I'm the Manager of Water and Planning for the Ausable Bayfield Conservation Authority. As many of you know, the ABCA has been hosting these meetings since 2000, after the flooding in 2000, and we use them as a vehicle to promote emergency planning amongst the concerned agencies and highlight flood emergency issues which are related to our programs here at the ABCA. In previous meetings, we've had an opportunity for good discussion. We certainly want that discussion. It helps us to meet our clients' needs and the municipality's needs for what we're doing in emergency planning with regards to flooding. It helps the importance of communications amongst the agencies as well. We've also looked at some of the tools which are available for municipal staff and what information should be included in the emergency plan to deal with the flooding. Today's workshop will be including Ross Wilson is going to be talking about the Park Hill Dam. Tommy Kokas will be talking about events that occurred in 2021. And as always, Davin is going to be overviewing the roles and responsibilities in flood emergencies. And a little bit later, given that I'm looking out the window at a lot of rain, he's going to present some information on the current watershed conditions and the outlook for the next day or two. As always, at the end, we'll be opening the floor up for discussions. We want the discussion, we want the questions, so that we can be as responsible as we can for you. Also important is future meetings and what would be helpful for you. We recognize that in some instances, some of these meetings are repetitious, and it would be helpful to know what topics you'd like some discussion on. And with that, we are recording things, as you see, so we'll be able to make that available for others in the future. And unless there's any procedural questions, I'll turn it over to Davin, who's our Water Resources Coordinator, and he will present the ABCA's emergency plan, roles and responsibilities, and then again, the watershed conditions near the end of the day, or the end of the meeting.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to look around and see a lot of familiar names, but it's also nice to see some new names on here as well. So as Jeff said, it can get repetitious for those that have seen it, so we do try to tweak it and change it from year to year. Certainly the topics we like to change yearly. My presentation is really a walkthrough of the flood emergency plan, what our roles and responsibilities are, and we'll talk a little bit later about the watershed conditions and what the outlook is. And as Jeff mentioned, we'll talk about the next couple of days because we are in an active situation. We'll also look 2 weeks out as to what our risks might be. So the roles and responsibilities during a flood emergency. We'll talk about who the partners are in the province, what each of those roles are, and some of the things that those different agencies do during a flood emergency. Before we get into that, I want to talk just a little bit about the specifics of the Ausable Bayfield Conservation Authority's watershed. And it starts with looking at a watershed map and just getting an idea of where the flood-prone areas are, or the floodplains. Now, this is in the flood emergency plan, but for purposes right now, we can look at the areas that are shaded blue are your floodplain areas that would typically be prone to flooding. So yeah, the areas in blue are the floodplain areas in the watershed, and the areas that are circled in red are we've identified as our flood damage centers, communities that are prone to flooding or more extensive flooding. Our watershed, we have 4 main watersheds. With the Bayfield River that starts in Logan Township, which is part of West Perth, near Dublin. That flows out to the Lake Huron at Bayfield. Then we have the Ausable River, which starts up near Staffa and flows out through to Port Franks. We also have Park Hill Creek that outlets at Grand Bend. Then we have a Gullies area. Then we have a smaller watershed that flows out into Lake Huron as well. That's Mud Creek. This will be important later when we talk about, when Ross talks about the presentation on the Park Hill Dam, just to show that the watersheds are in fact different. The Ausable is separated from Park Hill Creek. A little brief history here on how the Ausable River has flown over time. And you can see that the headwaters up in Staff on the top right, flows through Exeter. It does a big J hook. It turns immediately north at Arkona. It originally ran to what is known as Grand Bend. This is why they call it the Grand Bend. It's because the river made a turn back on itself through the dunes area of the Pinery and outletting at Port Franks. In the 1880s, a cut was made. It's called the Salt Cut, and that was basically a shortcut for the water, help for drainage, help for movement of or transport, but it was cut out there in the 1880s directly to Port Franks. Park Hill Creek at that time would flow from Dashwood all the way through to Grand Bend and still using the old channel outlet at Port Franks. But in 1890s, a cut was made at Grand Bend as well. So Park Hill Creek now had a direct outlet into Lake Huron. That severed a channel through the Pinery, which we now know as the old Ausable Channel, but also left an old channel between what was originally the confluence of Park Hill Creek and the Ausable River. Now, and we refer to that today as Devil's Elbow. So that channel has been abandoned as well. So that just shows how the watershed has changed over time, and that's through those cuts that were made out into the lake at Port Franks and Grand Bend. So the Conservation Authority has a number of programs designed to minimize or prevent flood damage. We have numerous projects or structures that are in place to do so. We also have a regulations program that's in place, and it's designed to keep development out of hazardous areas. We also do that through our plan input and review. And then where we know we have areas that are at risk of flooding, we have emergency planning. We do that through the flood emergency plan, but also working with the municipalities to develop flood plans of their own. And then we have a warning system. So a flood forecasting and warning system that I'm going to go into a little more detail about throughout this presentation. So the province, we've identified 3 key players in flood emergencies, that being the province itself, the municipalities, and the conservation authorities. The provincial role, and I'm only going to say this one once, it's the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources, and Forestry. I'm just, from here on in, I'm going to refer to it as the Ministry of Natural Resources. They are the lead for flood emergencies in the province. EMO, or Emergency Management Ontario, this provincial emergency plan that's been developed. The province provides early notices to its partners. It also provides funding to maintain the stream flow forecasting networks, and where required, would provide a provincial assistance. The municipal role, starting off with the HIRA, or the Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. Most municipalities have identified flood risks in their HIRA. From that, they would create an emergency plan that identifies the flood risk. We've identified the municipality as first responders, and also responsible for the welfare of the residents, and that's for dissemination of the notifications or whatever information needs to be sent out to the residents. And also, again, as first response. The Conservation Authority's role, we develop a flood emergency plan, which hopefully most on here have or are named in. We maintain a monitoring system. We interpret the forecast that we receive and couple that with the watershed conditions. We use a model to help us with our decision making, and that model can help forecast what the stream flow might be in a particular event. And this is just a caption of what that output might look like for us. We have a simulated and observed flow, and then we can add precipitation to that and get an idea of where we expect flows to go to. Once we have a handle on the risk levels of this event, we will send a warning out to the municipalities. However, I'm going to talk about the levels of messaging. They're not, warning is the most severe level of messaging, but we have more minor messages that we'll walk through first. We provide technical assistance back with our partners. We liaise between the province and our municipalities, and we try to stimulate planning. And we do that through this exercise each year, and also working with our municipalities on different flood exercises. So the flood emergency plan, this is what it looks like. This is what you should have a copy of. It identifies the responsibilities of the authority, the actions that we take, the duties of specific staff at the authority, and then the actions of the municipality and other agencies during a flood event. And it's going to be a very high level review here. But we've identified flood response coordinators and officers. We issue flood messages, and I'll talk about the 3 levels here. The lowest level messaging is a watershed condition statement. Typically, it's either a flood outlook or a water safety. Sometimes we combine that messaging. And if we're expecting the potential for something a little more severe to be happening, we might issue a flood watch. And if something of a larger flood is happening, we'll issue a flood warning. So that's when it's imminent or occurring. We have dam operations. We'll also conduct a river watch with our staff. And there's communications and record keeping, and that goes back and forth between not just us, but also the municipalities in the province. The staff that we've identified, we have a flood response coordinator. We have a flood duty officer. That's a rotating position. And that's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week position. So they would get all the emergency, they have the emergency phone and would be the contact in a case of emergencies. We have a technical support officer. We have office support staff, communication support, and then field support. The actions during a flood emergency, the municipality would assess and determine if a declaration of an emergency is necessary. That would come from the mayor. If yes, then implement the emergency response plan. If no, it's a matter of monitoring the situation, taking appropriate actions, and liaising with the CA. And we've done a really good job with that with our municipalities during the flood events in recent times. So it's that two-way communication has been very good. For those just looking for information on the flood status or where we're at right now, you can just go to our website on the main page, and there's buttons at the top that gives you the flood status. This is the older capture here, but right now we'd actually be in a yellow. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But with the terminology, it's important to get the terminology right, and we've worked really hard as the conservation authorities in the province over the last 10 years to make the messaging consistent. And as I mentioned, we have the low-level watershed condition statements or shoreline condition statements, but we also have the watches and warnings. And this little graphic, and I've used it before, so some might have seen this, but it does make it very simple. If we're looking at a potential for a cupcake event, we have here a cupcake watch, and that really means that the ingredients are there for a cupcake to happen. And if we're into a cupcake warning, that means the cupcake is there. It's right in front of you. So we could swap the terms cupcake with flood. So you have the ingredients, that's a watch. And when something's imminent or occurring or right there in front of you, it's a warning. It's a draft message. I won't labor this one too much because I'm going to show you the message we put out today a little later. But this is what you would see. This here is a watershed condition statement. This would be a flood outlook and water safety. Lines of communication that we have is we communicate our messaging through a number of agencies and individuals. The municipal flood coordinators, the CEMCs for the municipality and county. They then disseminate it through the residences, businesses, and the general public. But we also have a loop through the OPP in our watershed. And these loops, it shows in one direction, but they really do, in an event or a flood emergency, these lines are going both directions because that's the liaison that's happening between the different agencies at the time. So we now have an email delivery system that's been used to replace what was long used as a fax system for sending your messages out. Someone here will remember that. We send the emails to the contacts where the email's been provided. If you want to be added to that list, if you're not already on it, you can contact us and we will add you to that list. But that list goes out to the municipal contacts, the OPP, Ministry of Natural Resources, news and media sources, and staff and directors. This is a really important thing when it comes to the confirmation of receipt. We want to ensure that that message is confirmed by phone when we ask for it, and that's typically for a watch or a warning. The other way of handling that, though, is confirmed by a non-automated email. So say a read receipt is not acceptable. It has to be an intentful response. You could have a third party respond on your behalf. That party will assume the responsibility that the message does get delivered to the main contact, though. So that's a really high-end overview. If there are any questions, you can ask at any time or at the end of the meeting. That's fine too. I'm just going to throw some slides by here just as a reminder that flooding does happen. It is infrequent and sometimes unpredictable. We like to hope it's not unpredictable, but sometimes it is. So I'm looking at the image here, this is going back to 2006. This was just a heavy rainfall event over a small area, but 10 inches in an hour. And it washed out a county road here. This is Petty Street, just south of, south of Nairn, I guess. This here is the Salvo Drive at Drummond Road. This area gets flooded out quite frequently. I would say every 4 or 5 years we see floods of this magnitude, but quite a large floodplain and quite a number of roads affected in this case. This is 2009 at Silver Bridge. This is just east of Thetford. And I point this out. This is kind of where our ice jams begin or come from. It's the upper portions of the rivers, and this shows the ice breakup. And I'll point out what's unique here. There's about 4 meters of ice here. It's hard to tell, but it's a very deep, incised river, and probably, yeah, for sure 4 meters of ice, a big wall of it moving downstream. And this is what would impact the community of Port Franks. Results of an ice jam at the harbor in Bayfield. And you can see the after effects of the ice coming through and ripping out the shore walls, docks, other structures. It's a real mess down there. When that ice comes through, it'll grab stuff and move it. Another ice jam, a little different type of ice jam, but this happened in the Bayfield River by the Wildwood campground. And it was a very short-lived ice jam, but it was enough to back up 6 feet of water and flood out the lower part of the trailer park. Quite extensive damage in the lower area of the river there. And we were fortunate enough to get a clear day to get an aerial shot of the size of the ice jam. Sort of in the center of the screen is where the ice jam is built up. By this time, the levels had come down and water was getting away under the ice. And then we did have a flood warning issued for Bayfield for that entire weekend, though. If that jam were to let loose and move down to the village there. Summer of 2014 had a significant number of cells trained through the Seaforth area. Produced up to 9 inches of rain. Runoff was very quick. This is at the Lions Park. And enough in this case here that the wading pool, the kiddie pool, was, I guess, taken over by the creek water here in Silver Creek. It did not get into the main pool, which is just behind those trees there. The Salvo River, this is a fairly typical scene in the Hay Swamp area, but there's an auto wreckers there that gets flooded out every so often. And you can see there's several feet of water there that have taken over many of those parked or old vehicles. Spring Break Bridge, this is during 2018. It's the second time we've seen levels like this, but what made this event really unique is that we had ice chunks floating down the river still. This is an old steel bridge that's sitting on abutments. The concern was that ice jams could get under that bridge and lift the bridge and pull it off those abutments. So what the municipality did in this case was add these concrete blocks to it to help weigh it down. The bridge is still in place. It's Bayfield River as well. This is an ice jam moving through under Highway 21. There was concern from MTO here. Again, a very similar thing to Springbank, where that ice, if it piled up high enough, could potentially lift that bridge off its abutment. Then we had the May 2019 rain event where we had 4 inches of rain in out of a couple hours, and saw some significant runoff in the Nairn and Park Hill areas. Another area that was affected by that event was Arkona, the Rockland Conservation Area. That's the conservation area where we have our waterfall, but very significant flows through there during that event. And another kind of event too is the lake impacted flooding, and this was the summer of 2019. This was a squall line or severe thunderstorms coming in off Lake Huron, and it created what they call a meteo tsunami, and it pushed a bunch of water in advance of the weather system, and they had about 3 feet of water quickly rise through this area, flooding out the businesses at the mouth in Grant Bend. Another lake event with the high winds over the last few years and the high lake levels. We've seen a number of examples where we've had lake water push inland and cause flooding. This October 2019 image was a little unique in that parts of the village of Port Franks were underwater for a long period of time, even after the winds had died down and the lake had receded, because it had blocked off the mouth of Mud Creek. This here is actually in the Ausable River itself, but you can see the number of docks were destroyed and boats pushed up onto the shoreline and left there when the water levels receded. And this was some of the community for, it's lasted about 3 days before it got back down again. And then this is your spring freshet, but this happened in January of 2020. A big melt, mostly a rainfall event though. And this is the Mud Creek on Outer Drive and Lambton Shores. One of many roads that were closed during that event. Another one here is same event. This is Coldstream Road. You can see the vehicle that got swept off the road. But to get a better perspective on this, if you look down the road where you see that white or a brighter color, that's snow on the road surface where the water had not crossed. So the water actually got up to that point, and this vehicle tried doing the slow crawl through that water, but there's enough flow going across that it ended up where it is. So flooding does happen, and there's going to be more to the story. Tommy's going to talk about the flood event of last September, but for now I'm going to hand it over to Ross for his presentation. I'll take any questions from now, I guess, at the end of the meeting. And if you stick with us to the end, I'm also going to provide a watershed conditions update with the winter flood outlook, or what's left of winter. So thank you.